So hi, this is going to be Henry VIII's foreign policy. So Henry, he was a Renaissance prince. He wanted power and glory, and his foreign policy aims were basically to be regarded as a heroic king, to establish a secure dynasty, to bring England to the center of European politics. He wanted to show aggression towards wars with France, which he did in quite a few occasions. He wanted to increase relations with the Netherlands to improve the trade of cloth, among other things. He wanted to, after he failed with all the wars, he did try to make peace. He did try to make peace throughout his reign, but that wasn't that successful, as you'll see. It was just peace treaty, war, peace treaty, war. There was even some treaties called the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, which collapsed. Like 2 or 3 years later. And Henry also wanted a pension from France. So if he can take over France, at least he can get some money from it. He did get this to some extent. That was Henry's aims, what Henry wanted. Then Henry's chief advisor, Thomas Wolsey, he was more peaceful. He wanted peace. He wanted to become pope, and he actually was in the running to become pope. He got recommended, but that fell out. He wanted to serve the king's interests. He wanted to be there, a yes man. He was just, whatever Henry wants, I'm going to give it to him. Literally, he was the Alter Rex, so he was basically a king, by name, because he controlled so many things. He wanted to raise taxes without parliament, so he could control everything himself. He wanted to be the king's favorite, which he kind of was until he fell out in 1529. So he was chief counselor from 1515 to 1529. He also wanted to preserve power balance in Europe, so England wasn't that far behind. He didn't want France to become the most powerful country. He didn't want Spain to become the most powerful country. He wanted to maintain the power balance and also put England at the center of European politics, so England would be more involved. They were split, even though they had kind of agreed on everything. There were splits. So with war, Wolsey was more of a pacifist, but because of his political interests, he went along with Henry's plan. They also disagreed on tax and divorce. Henry wanted a divorce. Wolsey didn't. I don't think, because he did try to get it with the legatine court and that deal, but he postponed it as much as he could. And that cost him his life. I mean, Wolsey died because he fell out of favor with Henry because he didn't get the divorce in time. So, yeah. So, in relation to war, Henry VII's counselors were against war. They thought it was expensive, unnecessary, and unsafe. Not only to the people, but also to England, because if England went to war with France and England lost, they lost money, they lost manpower, and who's to say that France in a few years wouldn't attack England and invade and take over the country? So yeah, that was Henry VII, but Henry VIII, he just needed war. He lived for war. He was constantly trying to get in fights. He did try to get a peace treaty in 1510 in March, but that didn't last long. He was pro-war. His ministers at the beginning were anti-war, but he surrounded himself with yes men like Wolsey, and they all agreed for political gain, but they took their time. So soon after that, Henry, the Earl of Suffolk, and Catherine of Aragon, they gained more power and more confidence in the country, especially Henry, and they went to war. Catherine of Aragon, she was Spanish, so she was the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon, and Ferdinand, he wanted to go to war with France to get Navarre, which he did, and Henry got involved, and that's a whole story. I'm going to get into that later. Then there's the whole deal with the Pope. in 1508, Henry VII still, the League of Cambrai was formed, which attacked Venice. Was formed by the Pope, and the Pope was unhappy with the success. The French victories threatened Venice, threatened Italian independence. So if France invaded Italy and gained power there, what would they do with the Pope? I mean, France was Catholic, but... So that was that. And then in October 1511, the Holy League was formed in Spain and Venice against France. Henry would go on to join in the next month, and it was because of his religious interests, which, don't forget, Henry was a defender of the faith. He was really Catholic at the beginning. He later broke away from the church because of the divorce, but up until now, he was very Catholic. And also, he saw France as the enemy. England traditionally sees France as the enemy, and I don't get why. I mean, they're a big country right there. It's powerful, but yeah. So he joined basically because of those two interests. So the European flashpoints. There was a French and Scottish alliance which threatened England. I mean, Scotland was up north and had a territorial, land border. France was right down south, and there was a sea border, but that wasn't that big. So England was constantly under threat from invasion, especially those two countries were collaborating and allied. Then there was the deal with the Holy Roman Emperor title, which Maximilian died, and it became available. So Francis of France wanted the title, Henry wanted the title, and Charles of Spain wanted it, and Charles managed to become Holy Roman Emperor. Charles V's brother married into Jagiellons of Hungary, a very powerful family. So that was, we got a lot of influence. Charles became the most powerful man in Europe during his life, because he had the Holy Roman Emperor. He was the Holy Roman Emperor. He had the King of Spain. He had family in the Netherlands, and also England kind of had a claim to the English throne, to the French throne. So the kings of England did have a claim, going back until, I think it's the 11th century. I don't know, but they had a claim. So Henry was like, I want to be king of France. That's a whole deal with France, at least in Henry's reign. So then there's the territorial disputes. There were literally all of them between Spain and France. They did not get along. Naples, Spain. Milan, Spain and France. Navarre, Spain and France. Burgundy, France. Netherlands, Spain. They were just back and forth. Spain and France, with territories. It's just, I get it. And the Ottoman expansion into North Africa could have been a possible conflict for Charles V, because the Ottomans, different religion than the Catholic Spain. So a spread of a different religion would have really threatened Spain and the territories they had in Africa. So that's that. And the economic matter in Europe was that Antwerp. It was like the center point for cloth trade and trade in general. But the Mediterranean waters were again occupied by the Ottomans and their allied pirates, which was a threat to Charles V. And religion. Religion is the other big one. They were all, the Ottomans were Muslim, as I said, and the French did side with German Protestants and the Ottomans, which opposed the Catholic Charles. France was Catholic, but they opposed Charles. It's like with Henry VII, Margaret of Burgundy. She did everything she could to oppose Henry VII. Now, France is doing everything they can to oppose both Charles from Spain and Henry from England. The emergence of the Ottoman Empire, it was more of the focus of Charles, not really Henry. Henry was insignificant. He was this new English monarch who didn't have that much of a standing, politically wise, like political speaking. England was like a tiny island compared to Spain and France, so it was the least of his worries. England wasn't that important. It had low population, low reputation, and low revenue compared to both the Holy Roman Emperor Charles and France. So it was France and Spain fighting, and England got between them. There's this analogy where it's a giant seesaw, and it's Charles on one side, France on the other side, and they're like going back and forth like that. And Henry just like switching sides. He's that small. He doesn't make a significance as in like to which side it tilts, but he tries. He's there. He makes an effort. It was more of a religious war, like with the Ottomans and Spain. And the Ottomans were the biggest of the worries. And Henry was basically used as a pawn. Henry VII didn't have that much of a foreign policy. Henry VIII did, but it's not like he was a great player in European politics this time. He was just there. He was a pawn. They just moved him around. He did try. Like the guy, you have to give him credit. He genuinely tried, but... So the first Anglo-French War. This is in 1512 to 1514. Remember, in March 1510, it was the Treaty of Peace, and this was 1512, so 2 years later, they were at war. This was Maximilian was still alive, and the aim was for Maximilian to seize the French crown, because France was an old enemy, and he wanted glory. So the Holy League in November 1511 was formed against the French, and they attacked France with Spain. Ferdinand used this. He saw the opportunity to take Navarre. It was England attacking Spain, England attacking France, Maximilian attacking France. He was attacking France. But he could send a few troops, which would make that much of a difference, and use the distraction to go for Navarre. And then withdrew after he got Navarre and made peace. Henry was really naive. He got played, and the troops returned diseased and mutinous because it was a stupid war which they should have gotten involved in the first place, because it didn't threaten England. England just went into the war because he wanted glory. Henry wanted to prove to the other European powers that he was a force to be reckoned with, but not really. 1513, Henry did invade France with 25,000 troops, and he managed to seize Therouanne and Tournai, which again, it wasn't that advantageous to Henry. It was more to Maximilian, because it weakened France a bit. It did secure Maximilian's borders, also Henry's. But yeah, it wasn't that much of a win. He won the Battle of the Spurs during this time, but yeah, he won Therouanne and Tournai and the Battle of the Spurs, but in the big picture, it wasn't a win. It was just he gained a few territories, but they were towns. They weren't even districts or anything. And in August of 1514, England made peace, managed to keep the towns, and he got the pension he wanted. He got a few £1,000 for his own, and got his sister married to the King of France, Louis XII. During this time, Wolsey was when he started to gain glory. He got involved in the organization of the war, and he was quite successful. So that's when he became a key minister. And this war is basically why Wolsey got to where he was. In 1518, the Treaty of London was signed, in which it was formally declared peace. And yeah, I mean, it was a short-term success. It wasn't that big a deal, but it was a success for Henry. He was almost 3 years into his reign, and he had managed to. No, by 1514, he was 5 years into his reign. He had managed to win a bit of territory in France, so that was good. But overall, it did establish an alliance. If one country was invaded, the others would help. But what he did, and this was, I think it was Wolsey. France signed a treaty with Henry. Then Spain signed a treaty with Henry. Then Maximilian signed a treaty with Henry. So they signed it separately, which really put England at the center of European politics, thus completing one of Henry's and Wolsey's aims. And because of this, the Treaty of London, 1518, Wolsey was chief minister. He gained a lot of favor with Henry. It did break down really easily. Charles V becomes Holy Roman Emperor. So Maximilian dies, Ferdinand dies, and soon after that, the King of France dies. So all that good relationships, that collapses. The current leaders of European countries, England, France, and Spain, they were in direct competition for the title of Holy Roman Emperor. And France just felt surrounded by Holy Roman Emperor lands after Charles wins the title, because he has on this side, this is France, on this side it has the Holy Roman Emperor territories, on this side it has Spain. Who was the King of Spain? The Holy Roman Emperor. And then there it had England, but not that important overall. In 1520 to 1525, Wolsey managed to arrange a series of meetings between Charles and France. He was a peaceful man. He didn't believe in the war. It was expensive and unnecessary. Yeah. Then there was the famous Field of the Cloth of Gold, the famous painting, which was in June 1520. It was a meeting between Francis and Henry. It was really expensive, and it served no diplomatic purpose whatsoever. So it was a waste of money, a waste of time. A bit of humiliation for Henry, because there was a boxing match, and Francis lost. Francis won, Henry lost. That was humiliating. And it cost 1 year's revenue, £15,000. This is for a huge party with the King of France. That's it. And between the field events, so before, after, and I don't know if maybe even during, no, not during, but before and after, he met with Charles. So he was talking with Spain. And Charles was a Habsburg, and Henry did support the Habsburgs. One of the main reasons, Catherine of Aragon. They got divorced in 1532, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, Catherine was still his wife, and she was Spanish, and Spain, along with England, wanted gains in France. So, in 1521, under the Treaty of Bruges, Bruges, I don't know how to pronounce that, Spain and England united due to Wolsey's advice. Wolsey said, hey, Henry, why don't you unite with Spain? Yes, they kind of humiliated you in the First French War, but that was another king. Join alliances with the Habsburgs. Charles is the most powerful man in Europe right now. If you were to face against France, you would definitely win with Charles. Your wife is Spanish, so she's going to support it. You can't lose, right? So Henry's like, yeah, I like that idea. And he signed the treaty. Then came the Second French War, 1522 to 1525. So the 1518 was the Treaty of London with with peace. And then 1521 was the Treaty of Bruges, or whatever, with Spain, and then the year after that was the war. So you can't say that Henry slacked off. You know, he was very active, especially during the early years of his reign. He was right there. So England tried to carry some raids into Picardy, and they were really ineffective. In 1523, the Duke of Bourbon, a nobleman, he took arms against Francis. The Duke of Bourbon was French. He took up arms against the French king. So there was a triple anti-French attack. So England, Spain, and France against France. So new agreements were signed and arranged. And in August of 1923, the Duke of Suffolk with 11,000 troops marched on Paris. Which 11,000 troops doesn't sound like a lot military-wise, but it was the best thing we could do. They failed to gain support because their hopes was, as they marched towards Paris, they would find people who supported Henry's aims and bring them along. But that failed. And Henry was again abandoned by the Duke of Bourbon. Duke of Suffolk failed by Charles. So in 1524, Wolsey is secretly negotiating with France for peace. He secretly meets with French ambassador to try to negotiate a peace treaty because he knows that if he went up to Henry and said, hey, shouldn't we be talking to France about negotiating peace since we're not getting anything out of it? He knew he would get. So he secretly met with the French ambassador and negotiated peace. But then in February of 1525, and 24th of February, in the Battle of Pavia, the French army is defeated by the Holy Roman Emperor in northern Italy. 10,000 French soldiers are killed, and Francis is captured. So France lost, and Spain won. Francis was taken to Madrid, and the foundations of European policy was shaken and destroyed. If Charles was the most powerful man in Europe by this time, he had gained even more power because he even had the King of France under his own power. Yeah. So basically, Henry did good. Like Wolsey did. He was really clever and he managed to get that alliance because if Henry were to be against Spain, he would be so screwed. Henry said, hey Charles, why don't we do this thing and we split France, right? I get the north, the English zone, you can get the south, Spanish, right? We both won, we were both at the battle, we both participated in this war, we both hate France. And Charles like, yeah, no, I'm gonna keep France, but like, thank you for the offer, I'm just gonna keep it for myself. And I'm gonna fight the Ottomans now, so just like shut up, don't bother me. In 1525, the Treaty of Moor, Henry signs this, and what he gets is, he renounces all titles to France. He said, okay, fine, I'm not the rightful king of France. Okay. But I want a pension. He got a pension, an annual pension of £20,000. Along with the pension he was receiving under the first war, because of the Aragon Anne Boleyn capture. And however, bad for Henry, in 1526, the Treaty of Madrid was signed, which means the Holy Roman Emperor and France were at peace. They weren't at war. And Francis is released from Madrid, and he joins the League of Cognac. And there was an anti-Habsburg League against France, Spain. The League of Cognac. They had peace, but they still hated the Spanish. So France joins with the Pope, with Venice and Florence. And eventually Henry would join in 1527 because he now hated Catherine. He had tried to do the legatine court, but I don't know if this was like by this time or a bit later on, but he didn't like Catherine anymore. But now, as you can see, Henry jumped around. Like when I said the Caesar, he just was constantly shifting. Before he was with France, the peace treaty. He then went to war with France, allied with Spain. Then went to war again with France, allied with Spain again. Now he was allied with France against Spain. He was just one side to another. He changed his alliances because he's mad. Why won't Charles give him France? Like, why? You're not gonna give me France? Oh, is that how it is? It's like that? Okay, so I'm gonna join with France and try to take over you. We all know how that turns out. He married Isabella of Portugal, not Princess Mary, as it had been stated in the treaty. So Henry was so mad, but Charles was like, I'm not going to deal with you anymore. I'm just going to go with my friend, my new friend Francis. That also doesn't last long. So this happened. The Holy Roman Emperor was way too powerful by this point, and both France and England recognized this. They were like, we have to do something. Henry wanted a divorce, and the only one who would grant him the divorce was the Pope. But the Pope was under the control of Charles because of the whole Venice, Rome thingy, Battle of Pavia, he had gained a lot of influence in Italy. He was under the control of Charles, the Pope. But Charles was Catherine of Aragon was Charles's aunt. So yeah, Charles was never gonna grant he's never gonna grant Henry the divorce. And again, the Pope, even if he wanted to, which he didn't, would have never done so because he was under the influence of Charles. So in 1527, the Treaty of Westminster was signed, which meant that France would marry Mary. Mary, by Mary I mean Mary Tudor, future Queen of England. That same year, Treaty of Amiens was signed, which meant that England would pay for a French attack on the Holy Roman Emperor and stop trade. So it was like, oh yeah, you want to go to war with Charles? Fine by me. You can marry my daughter, and I'll give you money. You can just attack. By the way, he was also mad before. I want just to make it extra clear. I think I said his sister. Charles married Isabella of Portugal, not Mary the First. I don't know if I said that correctly back then, but I'm just correcting myself. So, yeah, England imposed a trading embargo kind of deal on the Holy Roman Emperor, but class traders were like, no, why? We're gonna die of hunger. We're not gonna have money. So they abandoned the embargo in June of 1528, so a year. And they declared the war against the Habsburgs in 1528. So in June 1529, a year later, the French fought the Spanish at the Battle of Landriana, and that was a defeat for the French. And then in 1529, in August, it was the Treaty of Comfort, which was a peace only included right at the end of the treaty. Wolsey, by this point, he was fallen out of favor. He didn't get divorced. He failed to win the war against Spain because, Wolsey was the only person who could win the war in Henry's eyes. Like the Battle of Landriana, that defeat really hurt Henry and Wolsey at that point. So the Holy Roman Emperor soldiers, they won, but they weren't paid. So there was a whole sack of Rome incident. In May 1527, it was a week of violence in Rome, attacking churches, shrines, monasteries, everything. Rome was chaotic, and why are we not paid? What's this religious settlement? No. The soldiers were Lutherans. They followed Martin Luther's ideas, which was like, okay, Charles saw this and said, I'm just gonna capture Rome. Thank you very much. And that's how he gained the Pope's failure, because the Pope became now Charles's prisoner. So, in summary, by 1529, Charles was a dominant power. He would never grant a divorce. He would, after every single battle against Charles would win. So, Henry was quite screwed. So, then the whole matter with the divorce. There were legal attempts with the papal dispensation. He said, hey, Pope, can we get a divorce, please? It's just small, please. And the Pope's like, I would, but Charles controls me now, and he's your wife's nephew, so I'm gonna say no. And he could not be persuaded. So that was a disaster. And there were military attempts with the whole Treaty of Amiens. In 1528, the war against the Holy Roman Emperor, but the cloth trader protest made that end. There was a truce, and the French law set Londriana that made for the Treaty of Treaty of Cambrai to be signed. That was a legal attempt, and there was military attempts. 1527. Well, I said this before. Military attempts. There was a diplomatic attempt. The Pope didn't say, I'm not gonna annul the marriage. Like, it's not that I'm not gonna, but just it's a possibility. I'm not gonna do it right now. So he kept this bargaining chip. He said, hey Henry, you want this divorce? Okay, so you're gonna give me what I want. I'm gonna make you fight for it. In 1528, Pope sent Campeggio, a papal legate, and Wolsey, who by this point was also a papal legate, to investigate the case. So he gave Campeggio a dispensation saying the marriage was invalid. But he said, okay, you're only going to give this to Henry if you see that there's reason to annul the marriage and it's okay. That obviously didn't happen. The court, so that was June 1528. The court didn't open until May 1529. The Pope was buying time. And you could argue that Wolsey was too, because Wolsey was one of the key ministers and people organizing this. He's one of the papal legate. So, yeah, Wolsey just tried to make it last for as long as it could. I have my own theories, I'm not going to get into that. But he didn't want the divorce to take place. Maybe because Wolsey did rise to power through the Catholic Church. So that was one of the reasons, maybe. And then, after the Battle of Londriana, in June 1529, the Pope withdrew the court. So it lasted for 2 months. And it didn't get anything. And because of this, involved the whole Treaty of Cambrai and the whole fiasco. Wolsey fell from power. And in October, he got sent to York, because he was the Archbishop of York. But that was the first time he ever went to York. He was called to court in 1530, but he died on the way down. So yeah, that was the divorce. And then the Third French War, because you can't get enough of them. So in 1541, the French went back into war with the Holy Roman Emperor. And so in 1543 in February, there was an Anglo-Imperial alliance against France. So he switched sides again. He had with Spain, then he allied with France, And he allied with Spain again. After all, at this point, it had been long after the divorce, like over 10 years after this. They said, okay, we're going to invade within 2 years. Yep, yeah. But he was going to do it soon, but there was like a whole deal in Scotland, and Henry postponed. I'm going to get into the Scotland thing later on. Henry postponed it until 1544. So in 1544, Henry sailed to Calais with an army of 48,000. So, I mean, more than the 11,000 he sent to Paris. Like, you sent more soldiers to come to Calais than to Paris. But at this point, Henry was more secure. He did have more power. So that was good. And the plan was for Charles and Henry to march on Paris. But Henry was like, you betrayed me before, watch me betray you again. And he split his forces, sent the Duke of Norfolk to Montreal, and Henry to Boulogne. So that was kind of like, hey, I was abandoned by Ferdinand in the First French War. I was abandoned by you in the Second French War. This is payback time. He captured Boulogne. So he captured quite a significant territory. But that wasn't that successful, because Charles was like, oh, you're gonna abandon me, the most powerful man in Europe. Is that how it is? So Charles went and signed a peace of Crepy, in which he allied with Francis of France. So now Spain was against England. France was against England. And Henry was like, so guys, that was fun. And yeah, in September 1545, there was an invasion attempt from the French into England. They attacked the southern coastal towns, which was a failure, luckily for Henry. So peace talks were initiated. By this time, there was a considered government. Wolsey had fallen from power long before this. Cromwell had fallen from power long before that, because it was just 1545. Cromwell fell from power in 1539. So this was the considered government. So in June 1546, with the whole Treaty of Madrid, Henry managed to keep Boulogne, and he was paid outstanding pensions. And the entire war cost £3.5 million, which it is a lot by today's standards, but back then that was like, I don't know the exact conversion rate. It was a lot of money. So he gained money for the dissolution of his monasteries. He debased the coin, which didn't affect him that much, because this was June 1546. Henry died in January 1547. So it didn't affect him that much, but it affected Edward, especially Mary. Mary really suffered because of the debasement. But that's not really important now. And he borrowed the Antwerp market. So that was some income. And the pension he received was only of £700,000. So that just leaves £2.8 million to be paid. Then with the money from the monasteries, that's significantly less, but still a lot of money for England. And so as a historian, we have to think, Henry did see Boulogne as a success. It wasn't, it's American territory, and today it is still, but it was a victory for him. But it wasn't that worth it, because he got duped by Charles. So, like the saying goes, he won the battle, but he lost the war. Didn't lose, but he kind of lost. So, I'm going to now summarize the 3 French wars, because there are quite a few. So the first one, 12 to 14, the allies were Ferdinand of Aragon and Maximilian, Holy Roman Emperor. So the causes were hostility towards France, and Henry was a new king who needed to prove himself. He was strong. He wasn't afraid of war. The main events in 1513 the Battle of the Spurs, won by Henry, and the capture of Therouanne and Tournai. He got towns. He kept the towns. He got pensions, and he got his sister to marry Louis XII. So it was a relative success. He had some glory, but it wasn't that successful because he got used. The seesaw thing, he was just there to make the seesaw tilt in the person's direction rather than oppose the other one. I don't know, it wasn't that big a deal. So it was a small, very small success. But keeping in mind, Henry was just a new monarch. He was only, by the start of the war, on the throne for 3 years. I'd say it was good. So the Second French War, not world, 1522 to 1525, so 10 years after the first one started, he was allied with the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles. So in all three, he allied with the Holy Roman Emperor, which in the first one, he allied with Maximilian, the rest next to were with Charles, and all three he allies with Spain, only the first one is Ferdinand and then Charles. So he joined the war because of the causes were the Habsburg-Valois War, Catherine of Aragon, and again dreams of gains in France. How embarrassing was it that he had been on the throne for way over 10 years and he hadn't won France? How embarrassing. So he needed to get France to, gain glory. The main events, Battle of Pavia, won by Charles against France. So that was a failure for Henry. Not really, but eventually it would be. The Treaty of Moor cancelled all his claims to the French throne, gave him pension. He got a pension in all three of the wars, so that was good. He gained no territories. So yeah, he got his pension, but it only served to increase Charles's power, so it was a failure overall. And then is the Third French War, 1543 to 1546. So Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, was his ally, as I said before. Again, the Habsburg-Valois War. He wanted revenge against Charles in the war when he split his forces. And again, he wanted to control France, even though he had given up his claim. He captured Boulogne in 1544, and in the Treaty of Madrid, he kept Boulogne and pension, which was successful. The whole war thing, it was the most successful out of the three, but he wasn't fully duped by Charles because he did get territories. But Charles did sign the Treaty of Crepy, so that wasn't good. And it was short-lived because the war ended in June 46 and Henry died like 7 months later. So it was very short-lived for Henry himself. For England, it was longer, slightly, not that much, but yeah. So now Scotland. That was with France and Spain. So Scotland, relations in theory should be good, right? The king was married to Henry's sister, Margaret, so it should be good. Well, no, it really wasn't, because there was an old alliance, AULD alliance, Scotland with France. I mentioned it before at the beginning. So with the First French War in 1512, Scotland sided with France against England, and that was a big deal for Henry because Scotland shared a land border up north. So that was a big deal. And that was quite dangerous because if Scotland were to invade with enough manpower, that would not be good. And so there was the Battle of Flodden in 1513, and Henry was fighting in France. So Catherine of Aragon took charge, and she was successful. I mean, she didn't fight, but her army managed to defeat Scotland, and King James and 10,000 men died. So that was a really good thing for Henry. That was a really successful. So the new king was James V, and Margaret, she takes Regency, Margaret being an English princess. So that was really good for Henry. So now there was a baby king of Scotland, so for a while it was all calm. And then in 1541, when the baby was 30 years old, Henry managed to arrange a meeting with James V at York. He did not show. James did not show, and Henry was really mad. Like, hey, I'm not attacking you, just want to have a meeting. And so he said, okay, you're going to ignore me. I'm going to send a raid and I'm going to attack Scotland. So there was a battle at Solway Moss, and the Scots lost yet again. And left, you know how they left a baby at the Battle of Flodden? I think it was a few months old, like 6 months old. Well, here they left an even younger baby, a 6-day-old, not even weeks, days. Mary will go on to be Mary Queen of Scots, and she was left in charge. The regent was French. She was French. I forgot the name, but that wasn't that good. But Henry did try to get Edward, his son, to marry Mary, and he said, okay, if I had to improve relationships with Scotland, he would release the prisoners from Solway Moss. So increase the pro-English party in Scotland, and they travel with Mary to England so we can sign this treaty. So it was a Treaty of Gredich in July 1543, in which it was agreed that Edward and Mary would marry. But it did not include the renunciation of the old alliance, so France and Scotland were still technically allied, and Mary would go on to be, go on to marry the King of France, Francis II, but that was a very short marriage. She lived in France for a long time, but this is more Elizabeth's problem, not Henry. So the Earl of Aaron, the regent of Scotland, he seemed to, Mary's mother, she was regent for a bit. She was French, but then the current regent of Scotland, she seemed ready to cooperate with Henry, and also arrested Beaton, and a pillar of the old alliance, and followed the English religious policy. But really, Aaron was just playing Henry. He's like, he didn't betray him, but it was more, I'm gonna do what you want so I can get more power, because my queen is a 6-day-old baby. So that worked for a bit. But by September 1543, a pro-French party was in control. And in December, Beaton comes back. The Treaty of Greenwich is rejected, so now that treaty that said that Edward and Mary would marry, but got cancelled. And all Franco-Scottish alliances were renewed, and here is where the French Regency starts, I think. Henry was really, really angry, like, hey, I thought you were going to marry my son, and sent the Earl of Hertford to sack some Scottish ladies, but that failed. So, at Scotland, it was bad. Seemed to get good for a while, like with the Battle of Flodden and the Battle of Solway Moss, but then went back to bad. And with Edward, Mary, I don't know, but with Elizabeth, Scotland is a very serious problem. So that was Scotland, and now we have Ireland. Ireland, the English had some control over there. It was quite limited, so it was more an old policy ruled through the Earl of Kildare, and he did oppose Henry VII, but the new Earl of Kildare, he was kind of supported Henry, and he was quite cheap, so Henry better than nothing. So from 1520 to 1522, the Earl of Surrey became deputy. So he tried to assert control over Ireland, but that was a failure, and Kildare resumed his position. England gave support to Earl of Butler, who would be the Earl of Kildare's enemy. That was kind of suspicious. And now comes the era of the increased control. So after 1534, England gains more control in Ireland. The Kildare's son, Silken Thomas, rebelled against Cromwell, because by 1534, it was after Wolsey, was after Moor, so it was Cromwell as chief minister. And here, Silken Thomas rebelled against Cromwell. So he said, because Cromwell wanted to replace Kildare with an Englishman, and Silken Thomas, he wasn't the Earl of Kildare, but he was the heir to the title when his father died. So Kildare dies in prison, and the whole rebellion cost £40,000 to suppress and 14 months. So that really angered Henry, and Cromwell established a direct rule. So England would rule through Lord Deputy, really tight control, and had a permanent garrison of military control in the Pale. The Irish Parliament was revived, and it did not attempt to rule Gaelic Ireland, but at least they had a foothold in the Pale. So by 1536, the Irish Parliament started to reflect the English, and if you notice the date, 1536, that is the date of the English Reformation. So then there was a far greater control. And in 1520, Henry did want to bring Gaelic Ireland under English control. And in 1540, the new Lord Deputy, Sir Anthony St. Leger, does exactly that. So in 1541, Henry, with the help of Anthony Leger, he's like, okay, no, I'm not going to be Lord of Ireland, I'm going to be King of Ireland. So he was now King of England, Wales, and Ireland. And by this point, I think it was, soon after that, he would hopefully, not him, but the position of King of England would also be a King of Scotland, but that got denied in December of 1543. So he said, okay, I'm going to implement this new policy, the surrender and rebrand policy. So if Gaelic chiefs give me their land, I'm going to give it back as long as you surrender and support me. And you implement English laws. That's all I want. Not more, it's not that bad, right? It was really ambitious, but it was really expensive. And in 1543, around the time where the Treaty of Madrid was signed in Scotland, this was stopped because they couldn't afford it. So yeah, that was Henry VIII's foreign policy. I wouldn't say it was that successful because his aims was military glory. His main aim was military glory, and he got very little of it in the first French War. He got some. Not some. He got nothing in the second one. He got some in the third one, with Boulogne and the pension, £700,000. Then in Scotland, he got peace rather than power, so that wasn't that good for him. And in Ireland, he got more power, but that had to be stopped because of the cost. So yeah, that was Henry's foreign policy. So thank you for watching.